English adaptation of your script, kept complete and shaped for natural voiceover delivery. At the midnight threshold. On a stretch of coast where the wind had learned to speak in a low voice, there stood a house of grey stone with a thatched roof, facing west toward a sea almost always covered in a soft pewter light. Behind the house lay small meadows enclosed by old, crooked walls, and beyond them began the forest. It was not an immense forest, but it was ancient. The ash trees had grown there with the patience of centuries. Hawthorns bloomed white in the mild season. Hazels bent over paths of damp earth. Beneath their roots ran thin streams that sometimes vanished under moss and then revealed themselves again like ribbons of glass. In that house lived 5 people and a honey-colored dog who slept by the hearth. There was Brian, who repaired fishing nets for the neighbors and understood the language of the tides. There was his wife, Amir, who made thick butter, oat bread, and herbal remedies that smelled of mint and heather. There was Brian's mother, old Muireann, who had small hands, clear eyes, and a way of telling things as if she were patiently undoing a tangled skein of yarn. There were also 2 children, Nessa, who had already learned to listen to the silence of the forest without fear, and Fiash, who still ran after every butterfly as though the whole world had just been made for him that very morning. The house was modest, but it was filled with that special peace that is born when things are done slowly. The wooden spoons always rested on the same shelf. The boots dried beside the door. Rain tapped against the stones like patient fingers. And every night, before the shutters were closed and the fire was stirred one last time, someone would leave a bowl of fresh milk on the threshold. It was not an unusual custom there. No one explained it much. It was simply done. Muireann used to say that the threshold belonged neither entirely to the house nor entirely to the world. It was a seam, and seams, she said, should be treated kindly. She did not say it in a grave tone as if warning of some danger. She said it the way someone might remind you to set out an extra blanket in winter or suggest greeting the dawn. The milk, she would add, was not left there out of fear. It was left there out of courtesy, because the forest could see, because there were small footsteps that made no sound on the grass, because some nights, when the dew lingered a little longer than usual over the ferns, the world grew thinner, and it did no harm to let it be known that the house understood how to coexist. Brian had learned the custom as a child. Ymir had accepted it without difficulty when she came to live there. To her, the white bowl on the dark stone carried something of a household prayer. Nessa sometimes carried it in both hands, very solemnly as though she were bearing a tiny moon. Fiash, when he was smaller, had tried more than once to drink the milk before it even reached the door, and everyone had laughed. By morning, the bowl was empty, sometimes completely empty. Sometimes there would be a white trace clinging to the pottery. Other times it would be found spotless, as if washed clean by rainwater. Brian would say it could be hedgehogs, wildcats, maybe a weasel. Muireann would nod, never arguing with him, and then smile in a way that left the matter open. Life continued that way for many small years, which are the truest years of happiness. Years of lighting damp peat and hearing the roof creak in the gales. Years of picking blackberries in August and late apples in autumn. Years in which the forest was always a nearby presence, almost familiar, not domesticated, never fully understandable, but known in the way an old song is known. No one remembers when it was first learned, only that it has always been there. In spring, the children gathered bluebells at the edge of the woods without pulling too many. In summer, Ymir cut meadowsweet and tied it into bundles to dry beneath the beams. In autumn, Brian brought home bundles of firewood and baskets of mushrooms that Muireann inspected one by one with ceremonial attention. In winter, when the fog dropped early and the world seemed reduced to firelight, the smell of soup and the distant sound of the sea, The bowl of milk gleamed even whiter on the threshold, like a simple promise in the middle of the dark. Over the years, there were kindly signs, small things no one commented on too much, and yet everyone stored away somewhere in the back of the mind. One stormy night, when a roof tile came loose, it fell to the ground without breaking the window or harming anyone, despite the wind twisting hard across the house. One morning, a swarm of bees appeared resting calmly on a dead apple tree and allowed itself to be guided into a new hive box without a single sting. Once, Fiash wandered off among the hazels while chasing a bright feather, and came back home alone by following a path that no one remembered ever seeing before. In his hand, he carried a smooth, polished acorn, as though water had been rolling it over for a very long time. "The forest knows us," Mirren said that night, stirring the soup with an ashwood spoon. "Or we think that because we like feeling accompanied," Brian replied, though he said it softly and without much conviction. "They are two ways of saying the same thing," the old woman answered. Then she smiled. No one added anything more. Outside, the bowl waited on the stone. The months passed. Then came an autumn of very clear skies and cold nights. The sea carried the scent of dry salt. Sloes ripened in the hedgerows. Above the forest, flocks of starlings settled and wheeled together as though a single dark mind were shaping them in the air. That was when preparations for Samhain began. In that region, Samhain did not arrive with uproar, but with stillness and care. The house was swept thoroughly. A candle was left burning in the window. Apples were stewed with spices. Old stories were shared. The departed were remembered. And as Mirren said, a little more attention was paid to invisible paths. Because on those nights, the year breathed differently. For several days, Ymir busied herself drying herbs, storing butter in clay pots, and finishing a wool blanket she meant to give a newly widowed neighbor. Brian had to help repair a fence the wind had knocked down near the cliff. Nessa tried to make crowns of red leaves. Fiash wanted to carve a turnip with a cheerful face, although cheerful always turned out crooked. The house filled with chores, with the smell of toasted oats, with small hurryings. Peaceful hurryings, the kind that belong to people who know the order of their days well, and must, just for once, alter their pace a little. The eve of Samhain dawned in mist. From early morning, the damp clung to the glass and to sleeves. Muireann rose before anyone else and opened the door just a little. She looked at the threshold. The bowl was clean, cleaner than usual, so white it almost seemed to give off its own light in that grey morning. She said nothing. She simply picked it up, washed it again out of habit, and set it beside the sink. That day stretched out with an odd softness. The children helped gather fallen apples. Brian came home late, mud up to his knees and smelling of rain. Ymir needed barley bread. Muireann set slices of pear to dry near the hearth. Two neighbours came by to exchange flour for tallow candles and stayed to drink heather tea while talking about the weather, the sea, and the first real cold. By the time they left, dusk had already fallen. Then the true bustle of the night began. There was supper to serve, wet cloaks to dry, chairs to move aside so the scattered ash could be swept properly. Fiash, who had managed to smear himself all over with turnip pulp, had to be washed. Ymir's thimble had to be found among folds of wool, and Nessa insisted on telling her story about the white hair she had seen beside the well. The candle was set in the window. The soup was served. The wind began brushing against the roof, and in that accumulation of small things, in that deeply human and easily understood domestic tide, the gesture of leaving milk on the threshold slipped out of the night the way a thread of smoke slips through a crack. It was not out of disdain. It was not mockery. It was not because they had stopped believing or stopped caring. It was simply forgetfulness. When everyone was in bed and the fire had sunk to a reddish breath, the house settled into that warm stillness only found in homes inhabited by people who are tired and at peace. The honey-colored dog sighed once in its sleep. Outside, the mist came down from the forest and spread over the meadow like combed wool. None of them knew at what moment the air changed. Brian was the first to wake, not because of a loud noise, quite the opposite. What woke him was a delicacy, a sequence of sounds so faint that it took him a moment to understand they were coming from outside. He opened his eyes in the dimness and lay still, listening. The room was cold. Ymir slept peacefully at his side. From the main room came the faint, spent smell of peat, and there, beyond the wall, very near the door, was a sound like glass tapping softly against stone. Tick. Then a small silence. Tick. It was not a branch, not rain, not an animal scratching. Brian sat up slowly and listened harder. The sound came again, patient, as if someone were tapping a fine fingernail against the edge of an empty bowl. Then he remembered. He did not know why he knew it so suddenly, but he remembered all of it at once. The unfilled bowl, washed and forgotten beside the sink. The bare threshold. The night of Samhain. He rose with a calm but attentive heart. He did not feel fear. Rather, he felt that mixture of respect and embarrassment one feels when one realizes one has unintentionally failed in an old courtesy. He draped a blanket over his shoulders and walked barefoot into the main room. The embers still glowed. The dog had lifted its head, but it was not growling. Its ears were raised and its expression was curious. The tapping came again. Tick. Now it seemed to come not from the door itself, but from the low window facing east. Brian looked toward the table. There was the bowl, white, empty, waiting. He walked over, picked it up, and felt something strange at once. The pottery was warm as if it had been sitting in sunlight, although the whole house was cold and it was the middle of the night. He said nothing. He went to the sink, poured fresh milk from the clay jug, and filled the bowl halfway. The white surface quivered faintly. The moment his hand touched the latch, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, it was almost louder than the tapping had been. Brian opened the door. The mist stood outside, motionless and pearled. The world seemed made of breath. He bent down and set the bowl on the threshold stone. "Forgive the oversight," he murmured, not raising his voice as though speaking to a delicate guest who had already gone to sleep. The air smelled of wet leaves, distant sea, and freshly drawn milk. Nothing else happened. No figure showed itself in the mist. No light danced at the edge of the meadow. There was only a very soft whisper like the brushing of many grasses moving together, although no wind was blowing. Brian closed the door gently and returned to bed. By morning, the bowl was empty. Ymir stared at it for a long moment as she wiped the dew from the step with the edge of her apron. "I forgot," she said, almost to herself. "So did I," Brian answered. Murn, standing behind them with a shawl around her shoulders, looked toward the forest. The mist was slowly retreating among the trunks. The old woman did not seem upset. If anything, there was a glint of amusement in her eyes. "They could have sent a far less gentle reminder," she said. Nessa immediately looked up. "Was it the little folk?" she asked softly, with the carefully contained excitement of someone hoping the adults would not ruin a marvel with an explanation that was too simple. Murin bent down and touched the tip of her nose. "It was the forest reminding us of our manners," she said. Fiash wanted to know whether the fairies had been angry. Murin said no. She said there was a difference between anger and reminder. Sometimes a door left poorly closed did not bring a storm, only a draft that made you get up to shut it. And some of the world's courtesies worked that way. The matter could have ended there. In another house, perhaps it would have. But that morning, small incidents began. Small peculiarities touched with such gentle humor that no one could feel anything but a mixture of wonder and a smile. The first happened in the kitchen. Ymir was looking for the large oat spoon and could not find it anywhere. She rummaged through drawers, searched the table, checked the shelf where the pots were kept. Nothing. At last she opened the pantry door to get another one, and there it was, placed with exquisite care inside the honey jar, sunk only halfway in, as if someone had wanted to remind her that sweet things go well with patience. Ymir let out a brief laugh of disbelief. She took the spoon out, washed it, and went on with her work. Then it was Fayach's turn. He had left his clogs beside the bench. When he went to put them on before heading to the yard, he found inside each one a perfectly cracked walnut, the kernel intact, clean, and gleaming. There was no human way to explain how it had gotten there without the shell breaking in just that precise manner. Fayach held the walnuts up as if they were treasure. Nessa, seeing them, declared with great seriousness that it had all the appearance of an elegant prank. Later, while Brian was mending a rope behind the house, he heard a short whistle. He looked up. On top of the wall, lined up like little old women dressed in grey, sat 3 magpies watching him. Each held something white in its beak. A feather, a strand of wool, a late petal. They dropped them all at once and flew away. The 3 fragments landed right in front of him, forming a tiny spiral on the damp stone. Brian looked at it for a few seconds. Then he inclined his head, like someone accepting a joke he does not quite understand, but finds entirely proper. For the rest of the day, the whole house seemed very slightly shifted toward the unusual, though never toward the unsettling. A skein of thread appeared already untangled after Nessa had left it in an impossible knot. The dog stared for a long time at an empty corner and wagged its tail, pleased. 2 apples Ymir had set aside for cooking suddenly turned up polished to a shine, not a single speck of dirt left on them. And at dusk, when Myrn went to fetch water from the well, she found floating in the bucket an oak leaf folded into the shape of a little boat. Inside it rested 3 fennel seeds. The old woman smiled. "Ah," she said, and nothing more. Nessa, who had gone with her, asked what it meant. That we were forgiven before we had even finished apologizing. "And how do you know?" "Because someone who is offended does not go to the trouble of making pretty jokes." That night no one forgot the milk. Fayach insisted on carrying the bowl himself, though he had to do it with both hands and the tip of his tongue barely showing from concentration. Nessa accompanied him as if the 2 of them were part of a secret procession. Brian opened the door. Ymir held the candle. Myrn stood 1 step behind them, her hands folded over her shawl. The air was clear. The mist had withdrawn. The forest, dark and still, seemed to be listening. Fayach set the bowl on the threshold with such solemnity that even the dog stopped panting. "For you," he said. No one corrected the wording. They closed the door and gathered around the fire. Then Myrn began to tell a story, not as a warning, but as a memory. When she was a child on a farm farther north, they had once forgotten for 3 nights in a row to leave out cream and bread. Nothing terrible happened. Only the cows, when milked, gave such foamy milk that it spilled out of the buckets. Socks disappeared in pairs and reappeared hanging from the hawthorn. And one morning every door in the house was found standing open, but each broom had been carefully positioned so the chickens could not get inside. At last my mother left a larger bowl and a little honey, Myrn concluded, and the next morning she found primrose flowers on the shelf. "So it really was the little folk," Nessa said, satisfied. Myrn looked at her with tenderness. "Names are cloaks. Sometimes they keep you warm. Sometimes they cover too much. What matters is the relationship. Ymir gazed at the fire for a while. "I do not like the idea of owing something because we forgot," she admitted. "We do not owe fear," the old woman replied. "Only attention." That seemed to soothe her, and yet the forest had not quite finished reminding them in its own gentle way. The next night, a soft rain came, the kind that falls almost without sound. Before bed, Brian stepped outside briefly to secure the shed door. He came back with a slight furrow in his brow. "There are lights among the hazels," he said. He did not say flames or lanterns, just lights. Nessa and Fiach immediately hurried to the window, but Muireann told them not to press their faces to the glass. "From inside, looking is enough," she said. There they were, far off at the edge of the forest, several small lights. They did not burn like fire or sway like lanterns. They looked more like drops of moonlight suspended just above the ground. They moved slowly, separating and rejoining, as if following some secret pattern among the trunks. Ymir rested a hand on Brian's shoulder. "What do you think they are?" He took a while before answering. "I think the forest is taking a walk." No one laughed. It was a strange sentence, but strangely exact. The lights remained for a while, then they moved deeper among the trees and vanished one by one, as if the damp earth had absorbed them. The next morning they found one more thing beside the empty bowl. Not a coin, not a flower, not some impossible jewel. Only a little braid made of dried grass and 3 horsehairs tied with such delicacy that it seemed the work of a patient, almost transparent hand. Muireann picked it up with 2 fingers and hung it inside the house near the door. "For good fortune," she said. Brian did not ask how she knew. Neither did Ymir. From that day on, something changed in the family, though outwardly everything remained the same. They continued with their tasks, their harvests, their days of rain and bread, but the act of leaving the milk ceased to be merely custom. It became a conversation, a true greeting, a small bridge laid each night across the threshold, and the forest, as if it had graciously accepted the apology and decided to lessen the distance a little, began to show itself more closely in tiny details that gave the days a secret music. With the coming of November, the cold sharpened the air. The sea grew darker. Frost silvered the walls in the morning, and a pale veil settled over the spiderwebs in the garden. Brian lit the fire before full daylight, and the smell of peat mingled with fresh-cut bread, filling the house with a warmth that seemed even deeper when outside the meadows crackled underfoot. Every night the bowl returned to the threshold. Sometimes Nessa carried it, sometimes Fiach, provided he did not tilt it too much. Sometimes Ymir stepped out alone when everyone else had already settled in, and would pause for a moment beneath the winter sky to breathe in the damp scent of the earth. On those occasions she thought she could hear, beyond the hedges, a peaceful murmur, not words, more the sense that leaves, water, and branches understood one another in some old and courteous way. The little oddities continued, though no longer insistently, as if the reminder had given way to quiet companionship. On the windiest days, the washing came back in less of a tangle than one would expect. The hens found better shelter before the rain. A sack of oats that in another time would have spilled beyond saving was found one morning propped against the wall, its tear plugged by a thorn from a hawthorn branch fitted with astonishing precision. Brian removed it carefully and mended the sack. That evening, besides the milk, he left a small piece of bread spread with butter. He did not comment on it to anyone, but Muireann noticed the missing bread at the table and nodded without a word. One Sunday, when the sun showed itself through high, pale clouds, the family decided to go into the forest to gather late hazelnuts and dry branches. They did not go too deep. They knew well how far they liked to go, and where it was wiser not to venture without need. Muireann said every forest has a point beyond which it no longer wishes to be crossed by the human mind, only by roots and by whatever leaves no trace. Nessa loved that sentence. Fiach thought it unfair that there should be paths that refused to be explored. They walked over damp leaves, breathing in the smell of mushrooms, bark and cold soil. Shafts of sunlight filtered through here and there, lighting patches of moss like green cushions. Near a small clearing they found a ring of pale mushrooms, fine as porcelain. Fiach wanted to step on it to see if spores would rise, but Muireann gently took him by the wrist. "Not that," she said. "Why?" "Because not everything beautiful needs our footprint." Fiach accepted the answer. He crouched only to look. Between the mushrooms grew blades of grass still green. The circle was so perfect it might have been drawn with a compass. They walked on until they reached a stream. There, on a flat stone, they found something none of them remembered leaving. A very small wooden spoon, carved from a single piece and polished until it was smooth as old bone. It had no decoration except for a spiral on the handle. Nessa held it in her palm. "It is for a tiny house," she whispered. "Or for measuring carefully what deserves to be measured," said Muireann. The little spoon came home with them and was placed on the shelf beside the grass braid and a chipped blue bowl that had belonged to Ymir's mother. Those things gathered there began to create a kind of quiet corner that no one called an altar or a memorial, though it served a little as both. Everyone, without quite noticing, lowered their voice when passing by it. Little by little, winter life found its shape. At dawn, Ymir churned cream in the kitchen while outside the rooster crowed as though it wanted to split the frost in two. Brian chopped firewood. Nessa learned from Muireann the old names of certain plants, even dried ones: meadow sweet, yarrow, comfrey, foxglove, which must not be touched without knowledge. Fiach built forts of sticks beside the wall sheltered from the wind, and as evening fell, when the light thickened and the forest turned into a bluish mass, someone prepared the bowl. One of those evenings, snow came earlier than expected. It was not a fierce snowfall. It fell silently, straight, almost shyly, first like powder, then in broader flakes. In little time, the stones of the wall were covered in white, and the thin branches began to bear little lines of ice. The children ran to the window. The dog barked at its own reflection in the fogged glass. Brian fed more peat to the fire. Ymir set a pot of broth to warm. The whole house took on that deep intimacy that snow gives when it erases the outer world and leaves only the bright heart of the rooms. "Do we leave milk even with snow?" Nessa asked. "Especially with snow," Muireann answered. "It will turn icy. Then it will be cold milk offered in goodwill, and goodwill enters where other things do not." That night Brian went out wrapped in a heavy cloak. The snow crunched beneath his boots. He set the bowl on the threshold, shielded the shelf above it a little so flakes would not fall into it, and came back in quickly to the warmth. From the window they looked out over the whiteness of the world, faintly shaped by moonlight. The next morning, before anyone else opened the door, Fiach announced that he wanted to be the first to see whether the milk had disappeared. He ran, still barefoot, to the entryway. Ymir went after him so he would not step on the frozen stone. When she opened the door, the cold air rushed in like a bright breath. The bowl was empty, and around it, on the untouched snow, were footprints. Not human footprints, not fox or badger. They were faint, delicate marks, the sort that might be left by very small feet wrapped in leaves or shoes made of stems. They circled the bowl in a tiny dance. They came and went from the edge of the path, but vanished before reaching the undergrowth, as if the snow there refused to preserve them. Fiach's eyes widened with such pure wonder that it almost looked painful. "Do not let anyone step on them," Nessa whispered at once. No one did. They remained there much of the morning. They glittered in the weak sun. Then as the day advanced, they softened until they disappeared. But the image fastened itself to the house the way a beautiful song does. That same evening, while the snow was beginning to melt at the edges of the roof, the widowed neighbor for whom Ymir had sewn the blanket came to the door. She brought a basket of onions and news from the road. She had tea with them, spoke a while about the weather and a lost horse near the harbour, and as she was leaving she paused in front of the quiet corner of the shelf where the grass braid hung. "You have good fortune here," she said. Ymir smiled cautiously. "We try to get along well with the neighbours." The woman looked toward the forest, visible between the shadows of twilight, and smiled too, in a way that was almost complicit. "They are the oldest neighbours," she said. Then she went away down the path, wrapped in her dark cloak. That sentence stayed with Ymir for days, while kneading dough, while shaking out blankets, while milking beneath a leaden sky. The oldest neighbours. There was truth in that, she thought. A truth that did not need to be pinned down with hard words. The forest had been there first. The hawthorn had been there first. The stream, the stone, the air in which stories nest, all of it existed before the house, before her family, before their name. And yet they lived together, not because the forest had yielded, not because the family had conquered a corner of it, but because a certain daily courtesy kept the seams in good repair. Ymir began to feel gratitude in a more conscious way, not only for the small helps or playful jokes, but for the companionship itself. One night when leaving the milk, she added in a low voice, "Let there be peace between us." She expected no answer. Even so, when she closed the door, she noticed that the air behind her suddenly smelled of apple and fern, although it was deep winter and neither was anywhere near. Toward the middle of the season, Muireann fell ill with a stubborn cough. Nothing serious at first, only weariness, loss of appetite, and a paleness that seemed made of mist. She spent more time sitting by the fire. Her hands, always busy, now rested over the blanket. Nessa brought her herbal infusions. Fiash tried to make her laugh with stories about an important rooster ruling the yard. Brian kept the fire lively without needing to be asked. Ymir made gentle broths and watched the old woman with quiet concern. The cough lasted several days, then a week. One dawn, Nessa woke because she thought she heard tiny bells far away. Not church bells, fine little bells like the ones tied to a light door, so you know when someone enters. She sat up and saw a faint glow beneath the door of the main room. She got out of bed, wrapped herself in her blanket, and stepped out without making a sound. The fire was almost out. Muireann slept in her chair, breathing with difficulty but without distress. And on the shelf in the quiet corner beside the grass braid and the wooden spoon, there was a small bunch of fresh thyme. Fresh in the heart of the cold. Nessa approached with childlike reverence and barely touched the leaves. At once their fragrance rose, warm and clean. She woke Ymir, who, upon seeing it, said nothing. She simply took the thyme, put water on to boil, and made an infusion. Muireann drank it slowly when she awoke. That very afternoon the cough began to loosen. Muireann recovered as old trees recover after a storm, without drama, but with a firmness that inspires respect. Day by day, colour returned to her cheeks. The cough grew lighter than rare. She resumed her short walks to the door, her habit of checking the dried herbs, and her tendency to gently correct any especially visible clumsiness of Fiach's when tying knots. No one spoke aloud about where the thyme had come from, though all of them now let their gaze linger on the shelf with new attention. Once it had dried, the little bunch was placed in a linen pouch and hung near the door as well. There it remained, giving off for weeks a faint fragrance that mingled with the smell of wood and smoke. Winter went on. Long rains came, mornings of low sky came, days when the forest looked like a tapestry of dark trunks and ferns flattened by rain. Then, almost before the family could point to the exact moment, the little announcements of spring began. A robin perched on the same post 3 mornings in a row. The mud on the path filled with new grass. Tight buds appeared on the hawthorn as though they held their own breath inside. With the return of light, the work also increased. Fences had to be repaired, the shed cleaned, the soil in the garden turned, the hives checked. Ymir sorted seeds. Brian fixed a worm-eaten wheel on the cart. Nessa wanted to plant broad beans in perfect rows. Fiash insisted on speaking with each hen before allowing it into the yard. Mjörn, strong again now, oversaw everything with that mixture of indulgence and precision that had made her the quiet center of the house for so many years. One afternoon in April, while the rain was resting and the air smelled of freshly opened earth, Brian found something at the forest edge. He was checking a broken stretch of wall when he saw, in the moss on a stone, a little ring woven from rush stems. It was too small for any adult human finger, and too carefully made to be the casual work of wind. He picked it up. When he touched it, the rushes felt dry but not brittle. They kept an impossible flexibility. He brought the ring home and placed it in the quiet corner. "Payment for the bread," Ymir said in a tone half playful, half reverent. "Or a way of saying the accounts are in good order," Mjörn added. Spring then unfolded its slow colors. The meadows filled with yellow. The apple trees put out pink blossom. The forest became more porous, less severe. The clearings filled with green light filtered through new leaves. Sometimes, when Nessa went to the stream with a small bucket, she said she felt as though someone were walking in step with her on the other side of the hedge. She never saw anything. She was never afraid. Only aware of a small, curious, respectful companionship. Fiash, for his part, began leaving small gifts beside the bowl. A pretty feather, a baked clay marble, a frayed ribbon he considered very valuable. Ymir sometimes removed the objects before nightfall, perhaps afraid that too much familiarity might be impolite. But Mjörn stopped her once. "Leave it," she said. "Children know a form of courtesy that grown people forget." By morning, some of those offerings were still there. Others were gone. The marble disappeared entirely. The feather, however, reappeared days later on Fiash's pillow, clean and neatly placed as though returned with thanks. Then Beltane arrived with its promise of warmth and growth. In nearby fields, some neighbors lit small fires. The family did not hold a great celebration, but Ymir braided red and white ribbons into the garden fence. Mjörn hung hawthorn branches over the stable door. The night air was so mild it felt like warm water. That night, besides milk, they left a tiny bowl of cream. There was no moon. Even so, near midnight, Nessa opened her eyes because a faint brightness was moving through the room. It was not coming from outside, but from the hall. She got up and peered out. The front door was closed. Everything seemed in order. But on the stone floor from the threshold to the shelf in the quiet corner, there was a line of hawthorn petals, white, small, scattered with perfect care, as if strewn by a playful hand that knew how to measure space in music. She woke Ymir, then Brian. Mjörn came out of her room too, wrapped in a blanket. The 4 of them stood looking at the pale trail in the dim light of the hearth, not daring to disturb anything. Fiash, finally awake, came yawning and clung to his sister's arm. "They came inside," he whispered, not frightened, only awestruck. "Not entirely," Mjörn replied, "only enough to bless the seam. No one stepped on the petals until the sun was fully up. Then Ymir gathered them carefully and laid them beneath the hawthorn at the boundary. From then on, the bond between the house and the forest became as natural as the movement of light through the seasons. They no longer expected wonders. They no longer searched for signs at every step. And for that very reason, when signs came, they felt all the more true. One noon in May, a first calf cow grew restless while giving birth. She paced, snorted, and could not settle. Brian and Ymir did everything they could to calm her. Muireann asked that no one raise their voice. While they prepared warm water and blankets, Nessa, without quite knowing why, took the little wooden spoon from the shelf and set it on the stable windowsill. She did it the way one does something that simply feels right without being able to explain it. Shortly afterward, the cow calmed down. The calf was born without difficulty. It was small, strong, and such a light brown color that once it was dry, it looked made of honey. Fiach insisted on calling it Oak, even though it was only a wobbling little calf. The spoon did not do that, Brian said, though he was smiling. No, Nessa agreed, but maybe it helped us stay calmer. Muireann heard that and gave her a long, satisfied look. With summer close at hand, the nights grew shorter. The milk on the threshold sometimes turned warm before dawn. Crickets sang in the tall grass. The forest smelled of sap, fern, and hidden flowers. Once, during a peach-colored dusk, Brian thought he saw a movement among the ash trees. Not pale bodies or wings, but the curve of several small figures turning in a clearing to the rhythm of a music that barely brushed his hearing. He did not try to get closer, he lowered his gaze. Waited a moment. When he looked again, the clearing was empty. That night, besides milk, he left a few drops of honey on the edge of the bowl. By then, the memory of the forgotten milk at Samhain had changed inside the family. It was no longer guilt, it had become a story. And like all good stories, it served less to point out a fault than to preserve a lesson. Nessa understood it as a lesson in attentiveness. Fiach as proof that the forest knew how to make jokes. Ymir as a reminder that shared life depends on small gestures. Brian as a humble way of accepting that not everything needs an explanation in order to deserve respect. And Muireann perhaps understood it in the oldest way of all, as the continuation of an unwritten pact maintained by generations who knew how to set milk on a stone and offer thanks without asking for too much. One afternoon in early June, when the air was rich with honeysuckle, a weary traveller came to the house asking for water. He carried a holly staff and a worn hat. Ymir offered him bread and cheese. Brian invited him to sit for a while on the bench outside. The man thanked them with courteous manners, and while he drank, looked at the threshold, the smooth stone, and the shelf where the bowl rested dry by day. "In this house," he said, "you still know how to live beside what cannot be seen." Brian exchanged a glance with Ymir. "We try not to be careless," he replied. The traveller smiled. "That is more than many manage." Before leaving, he placed on the table a small old coin with a hole through the center. "To hang where the wind may touch it," he said. He would not accept payment for it. He went away down the path toward the coast. They never saw him again. The coin was hung from the shed door on a red thread. When the wind blew, it made a sound so faint it called Brian back to the tapping that had woken him that Samhain night. A gentle warning, a delicate way of asking for attention without causing alarm. And so the wheel of the year kept turning. Summer came with long amber evenings. The sea reflected bands of copper at dusk. Bees droned heavily over the clover. Nettles grew tall along the stream. From the doorway of the house, the forest looked denser and deeper, dressed in full leaf, with pockets of shadow where the sun seemed to linger simply out of pleasure. In that season, the family spent more time outdoors. Brian worked on fences and nets. Ymir cut herbs to dry before the damp of autumn returned. Nessa gathered wild rose petals to make scented water. Fiach invented adventures with rush swords and fern helmets, though he always came back before supper, obedient to his mother's call. Not once did the bowl of milk go missing at night. Sometimes when the moon was waxing, the rim of the milk shone like silver. At other times, at dawn, the bowl would be found not only empty, but shifted slightly to the left as if someone had moved it to peer more easily beneath the door and into the house. It was never moved far, barely a gesture, a discreet little mischief. In time, they began to wait for those details the way one waits for a letter from a quiet neighbor. One afternoon, Nessa accompanied Muireann into the forest to gather St. John's wort and tender raspberry leaves. The warmth was gentle, not heavy. Mosquitoes buzzed near the water. Between the trunks, the air itself seemed green. They walked slowly, stopping here and there. Muireann showed her how to cut a plant without harming it, how always to leave more than one takes, how to touch the earth with one's fingers first as a reminder that nothing should be torn up blindly. They reached a small clearing where the grass grew short and luminous. There stood a flat stone, covered in white lichen. Muireann stopped. Nessa did the same. On the stone rested 7 hazelnuts arranged in a circle. In the center lay a fallen foxglove blossom, intact, like a pale violet bell. "Do not touch it," Muireann said, though her voice held no alarm. "Is it an offering? Perhaps, or a game, or a table laid for someone who is not us?" Nessa looked at it with quiet fascination. The clearing was so still she could hear a bee far in the distance. Then suddenly there came to her a sweet scent, like warm honey and apple leaves. She looked around. No one was there, only the light moving slowly through the foliage. They came home without gathering anything from that clearing. That night, when she left the milk, Nessa inclined her head toward the forest, the way she had seen her grandmother do so many times. She said nothing, but inwardly she felt the gesture completed a conversation. In midsummer, they shared a simple supper outside. Dark bread, fresh cheese, young onions, butter, and a red currant tart. The sky took a long time to darken. A blackbird sang from the hawthorn. The dog drowsed at the foot of the bench. Muireann told stories of when she was a child and believed fireflies were stitches that had come loose from the stars. Fiach asked to hear the story of the forgotten milk. Everyone laughed. The story now belonged to that safe place where memories go when time has digested them kindly. "And what if one day we forget again?" he asked, with the sudden seriousness children sometimes wear. Brian looked at the bowl, drying on the windowsill. "Then we will apologize again." "And will the forest forgive us?" Muireann took a slow breath before answering. When you live for many years beside someone, human or not, you learn that what matters is not never failing. What matters is repairing with tenderness. Nessa kept that sentence. Eimir did too. Summer continued. There were mornings of warm mist and afternoons of high wind. There was a distant storm that washed the sky blue all the way to the horizon. There were days of abundant work, so full that when night came, the whole house surrendered to sleep with gratitude. And always, before the door was shut, the white bowl on the stone. Toward the end of August, the forest began offering its fruits. Blackberries, mushrooms, fat hazelnuts. Nessa and Fiach went out with baskets. Eimir reminded them never to take everything from one place. Brian checked the ground first. Muireann later sorted the harvest with her wise expression. One morning after a night of gentle rain, they found the boundary path covered with grey feathers. Not many, just a faint line, as if a bird had preened itself while walking. The feathers led all the way to the house and stopped there. On the threshold, beside the empty bowl, lay a perfectly ripe blackberry, so dark it looked blue in the dawn light. Fiach picked it up with 2 fingers. "Can I eat it?" Eimir opened her mouth to reply, but Muireann shook her head with a smile. Not every gift is meant for the stomach. The blackberry was placed beneath the hawthorn. Before noon, it had disappeared. With September came a coolness at dawn so slight it was almost unnoticeable. Swallows began gathering on wires and high branches. Eimir worked harder at storing grain and drying apples. Brian checked the roof. Nessa noticed the afternoons closing in earlier. Fiach discovered to his great annoyance that the stream no longer invited him to leave his feet in it for long. One day, while sorting the chest where they kept blankets, Ymir found something tucked among the folds of an old quilt. A tiny silver bell gone dull with age, no bigger than a fingernail, without a clapper. It belonged to no one in the house. She held it in her palm while a soft sensation ran along her arms. "Look at this," she said to Brian. He examined it. It was not there before. Muireann looked up from her seat. Perhaps it was. Perhaps it only waited to be found when we were able to recognize it. They hung the little bell, clapperless, beside the pierced coin on the shed. When the wind blew, one made the other ring so softly that it sounded more like the memory of sound than sound itself. With the coming of the equinox, the forest began to turn gold at the edges. The nights stretched out again. Almost a full year had passed and was drawing near the point where this new brightness between the house and the threshold had begun. Samhain was approaching once more. They did not speak of it for several days, as if they all wanted to arrive at that date without weighing it down with too much intention. But the thought was there, in the way Ymir washed the bowl with extra care, in the way Brian checked the threshold stone and scraped the moss from it, in the watchful silence with which Nessa observed the forest at dusk, in Fiach's enthusiasm because he wanted to leave not only milk but cream, honey, bread, apples, and half the pantry. Courtesy is not disordered abundance, Muireann explained to him. It is choosing well and offering with a calm heart. The days before Samhain passed wrapped in a kindly expectation. Fine rains came. The apple trees dropped their last leaves. A primrose bloomed out of season at the boundary, small and pale. One afternoon, Nessa saw a white hare motionless among the hazels. She blinked, and it was gone. On the eve, exactly 1 year after the forgetting, the family lit a candle in the window. They prepared soup, bread, and stewed apples. They swept the house. They remembered the absent. The dog, older now but just as placid, remained stretched out beside the hearth. Outside, the mist again laid its wool over the meadow. This time, even before they sat down to supper, Fiach asked for the bull. "I do not want the forest to have to knock again," he said. Everyone smiled. They went out together. The night was cool and smelled of wet leaves. Brian carried the candle shielded with one hand. Ymir held the jug. Nessa carried the bowl. Fiach held a small piece of bread spread with honey, chosen after long deliberation. Muireann followed them slowly, her dark shawl barely stirring in the mist. Nessa set down the bowl. Fiach placed the bread beside the stone. And then something so slight, so beautiful, and so impossible to forget happened that for years each of them would tell it in a different way without ever exhausting its brightness. From the edge of the forest, music began to rise. Not a complete melody, not a human song, only a few clear notes as if water falling on stone had learned how to sound with intention. The notes came a little closer and hung in the air. Around them, between the trunks, small lights appeared. Many, more than before. They flickered unhurriedly, drawing low curves among ferns and roots. The mist softened them as if they were inside a giant pearl. No one spoke. No one moved forward. The music lasted only a few moments. Then the air brought the scent of apple, thyme, and warm milk. And the lights, one by one, inclined themselves. There's no other word for it. They did not vanish all at once. They did not flee. They seemed to bow like someone offering thanks for a courtesy properly fulfilled. Then they went back into the forest. The music ended. The night became only night again. Fiach let out all the air he had been holding. "They thanked us," he whispered. Muireann closed her eyes for a moment. "Yes," she said, "and we thanked them." After that Samhain night, the threshold ceased to be, for the family, merely a stone between the house and the outdoors. More than ever, it became a meeting place, Not something belonging to anyone, but a shared strip of space where courtesy could take visible form. The bowl of milk continued to appear every night, humble, white enough. But now each of them carried it with a calmer awareness, like someone tending a friendship that does not need to be explained in order to be true. The year began bending once more toward winter. Persistent rains came, silver dawns came, evenings when the forest seemed to sleep standing up, its bare branches conversing high above the low mist. Inside the house, however, everything was warm. The fire breathed slowly. Bread browned its crust, newly spun wool gathered in baskets. The dog dreamed, Fiosh grew. Nessa now helped her mother with quiet competence. Brian moved through the house with the assurance of someone who knew every creak in the wood, and Muireann, often seated by the window, seemed to be looking not only at the meadow and the forest, but at something passing between them that only she fully knew how to name. One grey afternoon, as they shelled dried peas beside the hearth, Fioch asked, "Grandmother, why do they like milk?" Muireann smiled before answering. "Perhaps for the same reason we like fresh bread, because it is simple, nourishing, and born from daily care. And why must it be left on the threshold and not farther away? Because the threshold says, this is our house, but we are not closed. It says we know there is an outside, and we treat it with respect." Fioch considered that in silence. Then he nodded with the gravity of someone who had just understood something important. Nessa added, watching the fire, "It is also a way of remembering that we live here for a time, not forever." Muireann turned her head toward her with an expression of pride so gentle it almost went unnoticed. "That too," she said. As the months passed, the family continued to receive small signs of that invisible neighborhood. One morning, a sprig of rowan heavy with red berries appeared on the windowsill at precisely the moment when Ymir was worried about a fragile neighbor's health. She prepared a mild infusion from it and carried it down the hill. The woman improved. Another day, after a nighttime gale, the beehives were found intact, although a tree had fallen very close by. By some strange and fortunate angle, its branches had come to rest without touching the boxes. And on several occasions when one of the family felt restless or sad without quite knowing why, the forest sent one of its quiet signs. A robin on the door frame, an impossible scent of flowers. In the cold, a braid of herbs found exactly where it was needed to bring the mind down into a kinder place. Not everything was wonder, of course. There was hard work too. Weariness, nights of roof leaks, and days of mud up to the ankles. There were small quarrels between siblings, bread that turned out too dense, and a stubborn sheep that broke through the fence more than once. But even those troubles seemed to settle inside a life sustained by an underlying harmony, like minor notes in a larger music that kept flowing. The years began to leave their mark. Nessa grew into a young woman with steady hands and a quiet step. She learned the work of the house from Ymir and from Muireann, the language of plants, seasons, and the forms of care that are not explained with raised voices. Fioch, slower to settle, kept that glimmer of play in his eyes for a long time. Even so, he learned to mend fences, read tracks, and not joke too close to the blooming hawthorn. Brian's temples turned grey. Ymir's voice became even more serene. Muireann grew frailer, more air than bone, but never lost the clarity of her eyes. One winter night, when the wind came racing in from the sea with a fine whistle, Muireann asked to be helped to sit near the door. She wanted to watch them leave the bowl. Nessa, now almost as tall as her mother, carried the milk. Fioch opened the door. The cold air came in smelling of salt and frost. Brian held the lamp. Ymir adjusted the shawl around the old woman's shoulders. Muireann looked at the threshold as though she were seeing not only the stone and the bowl, but many earlier nights, many vanished hands that had done the same thing. "That is it," she murmured. That is how a house is kept alight. She was not speaking of the fire. They all knew it. Not long afterward, just as spring was beginning to appear, Myrn departed in peace. There was no fear, no harshness, only a deep weariness and a farewell that seemed somehow already spoken over with the world. They kept watch over her in the house. The candle burned in the window. The neighbors came with bread, early flowers, and shared silences. Nessa placed on the shelf the little wooden spoon, the grass braid, the pouch of dried thyme, and a sprig of hawthorn. Fiach added a cracked walnut, too, in memory of that old joke that had made them laugh so much. That night, despite the sweet and heavy sorrow dwelling in the house, they did not forget the milk. Ymir insisted on carrying it herself. She stepped out alone onto the threshold, under a clear sky where the stars seemed very near. She set the bowl on the stone and said only, "Thank you for accompanying her all her life." Nothing more. When she came back inside, she found 3 white hawthorn petals on the floor of the entryway. It was not hawthorn season, and yet there they were, fresh, weightless, like an answer so kind it almost hurt with tenderness. The years kept moving on. The house changed and did not change. A wall was repaired, the yard was enlarged, the thatched roof was replaced with a new one. The honey-colored dog was buried beside the apple tree, and later another puppy took its place by the fire. Nessa became the most constant guardian of the threshold. Fiach finally learned to carry the bowl without spilling it, and never once forgot its place again. Brian and Ymir grew old with that quiet beauty belonging to people who have loved the same place well for a very long time. Sometimes travelers came, sometimes they stayed the night. Nearly all of them noticed the bowl and asked about it. The family never said much. A simple phrase was enough. "Here we leave milk for good accord." Those who understood, understood. Those who did not still smiled, perhaps made peaceful by the way it was said. So much time passed that the original forgetting became a family legend. It was told on rainy winter nights between warm cups and red embers. The children of the next generation widened their eyes when they heard of the tapping of the bowl that had woken Brian. And someone always added that the forest had not sent a reproach, but a gentle reminder. That was the part that mattered. Not the mistake, but the kindness with which it had been pointed out. Not fear, but relationship. And so, season after season, the custom outlived those who had first practiced it. The milk on the threshold passed from grandmother's hands to young hands. The forest continued breathing behind the house. The hawthorn bloomed every year. The lights sometimes showed themselves again on Samhain. And now and then a delicate joke returned when least expected. A lost key found on a bed of moss on the doorstep bench. A ball of yarn untangled without human help. A little spoon out of place but always set down where a smile was needed. Much later, on a quiet autumn night when Nessa was already a mature woman and Fiach held his own half-asleep son in his arms, the child asked why the bowl had to be set down just before the door was closed. Nessa crouched to his height. Beyond them, the forest was a weave of shadows and damp perfume. "Because the house sleeps better when it remembers to be kind," she said. The boy seemed to accept the answer with the immediate wisdom very young children sometimes have. He took the bowl in both hands. His father helped him keep it level. Together they set it on the smooth stone. The night was calm. From the edge of the forest came a fine sound, almost like a clapperless bell brushed by the wind. The child smiled. The door closed. Inside, the fire lit the stone walls and the smoke climbed slowly toward the beams. Outside, the milk waited on the threshold between human warmth and the old breath of the forest. And in that exact strip of space where no thing is entirely one thing or entirely another, the simplest and deepest pact went on living. To give something small with regularity, to receive in return a gentle companionship, to remember that the earth has memory, and that courtesy, when practiced with tenderness, can make the world a more habitable place. Perhaps that was always what the forest had wanted to teach them, that there are doors that close to keep in the warmth, and there are thresholds that remain open, not to danger, but to good neighborliness between the visible and the invisible, that a bowl of milk can also be a lamp, that forgetfulness, when it meets a kindly answer, becomes learning, and that the happiest houses are not the ones that believe themselves alone in the middle of the countryside, but the ones that know at nightfall that among the ash trees, the hawthorns, and the mist, someone receives their small gesture and returns it multiplied as quiet fortune, delicate humor, light protection, and peace. That is why when the coastal wind lowers and the forest begins to smell of wet leaves, people in that region still tell the story of a family who once forgot the milk on the threshold and received, instead of punishment, a polite tap against the glass of the night. Tick. Only that. Soft enough not to frighten anyone, clear enough to be understood. And ever since, in that grey stone house facing west, the white bowl on the dark stone has never been absent again, every night, like a little moon, like an ancient courtesy, like a way of saying before sleep that there is peace between the house and the forest.